The lock at Geldeston is a unique spot, steeped in history. Records show it was in operation as early as 1670, a key stopping point along the River Waveney back in the days when rivers, not roads, were used to transport goods from the coast inland. Cargo continued to pass through here for more than 250 years, until the lock closed in 1934.
The Broads are very unusual in England. You can go 200 miles without going through a lock, and it's only when you get this far up the Waveney that they had to do something about the river to make it passable for large boats trading up and down the river to be able to get further inland. And that happened in the 1670s when they made 3 locks all the way up to Bungay. I mean, the wherries, which were designed specially for the Broads, are the equivalent of an HGV, of a heavy goods vehicle. They can carry a vast amount. They can carry more than road traffic, even when it was motorised.
The wherries are remarkably different, for instance, to the narrowboats, for which we're most used to seeing craft using locks. Much wider for a start, much deeper draft, and somewhat shaped differently as well. Very expensive business making a lock, and also a huge volume of water used either to empty or to fill. So the most economical way of doing it was to get 2 craft in at once. So you keep the passage of the craft going for one thing, to stop those piratical perishers from shoving their way through when they get impatient, but also the volume of water be the same, but you're getting 2 craft through.
My father came in 1912 and he was a maltster, and the wherries used to come down twice a week, probably once a week, full of barley or malt, you know. And in 1920, that was Watney Come and Read then, and they bought it, and they had the rights of for the wherries to come down, and they used to repair the locks and the little things in the summertime. They used to finish malting about May, I think it was, until September, and he used to do all the odd jobs, and if anything wasn't mended, he used to mend it. You see the locks all wood, aren't they? Well, if one of the uprights was a bit rotten, he'd cut that out and put a new piece in, so that held back the water. That's the main reason to hold the water back, wasn't it?
Strictly speaking, this is Shipmeadow Lock. And so in Geldeston we became an industrial village. At its peak, I think, 7 maltings and a brewery which supplied 30 pubs up and down the valley, up to Southwold, including some in Norwich, the 9 Bells, and great stores for coal and for salt.
She was originally built in 1898 for a maltster and general dealer based at Bungay. So she would have been up and down through there quite a lot, carrying barley and wheat one way, and probably barrels of beer and the like the other, and spent hops as well, taking those to farmers' fields to build manure heaps and the like.
At the back that had a little cubby hole with a stove in with 2 bunks, and if they got becalmed or anything, they'd had what they called quants, and they put her on to sleep and walk, because you could walk down the side, and they'd push that along.
Wherrymen tended to want to push on the whole time, so they got paid by the trip, not by the hour. And so if they were sailing up here, what they should have done was lower the sail in good time and come into the lock slowly. But if there was a high tide, so that the water was nearly levelled off, they would keep sailing, come in quite fast, and the boat would push the gates open against, if it's not too much head of water. And of course that could cause damage. And in order to prevent them doing that, in time a beam was put across the lock, both at the bottom and top, to prevent that. But that of course was a nuisance for the wherrymen, because they meant that they then had to lower not just their sail but the mast as well. The construction of the lock, the sides are curved. Now that doesn't make more room for the wherries, because they're restricted by the width of the entrance gates. But those curved sides are for strength. It's rather like an arched bridge, better than a flat top bridge. The same way this, and the same as corrugated iron, is more rigid. It won't bend in one direction. Most locks throughout the country have straight sides, and they have to have very strong construction to hold the sides back.
My grandfather was the locks keeper. He was huge. He was about 6'4", 6'5", and he weighed close on 18 stone. Granny, she had 18 children. He used to amuse us kids by getting 2 garden spades. We'd stand one on either spade, and then Mother would stand in front and stand on it as well, and he'd lift the 3 of us off the ground up in front of you.
Well, the stories are legion, of course, of Wherrymen drinking and having a jolly good time at all the pubs. I mean, there were far more pubs around then than there are now, of course.
That was a small pub as such. That wasn't a proper pub. Drink was served, which was mainly very mild beer from the what was the sitting room table. There was 2 barrels of beer in the background, which the Wherrymen used to, when they pulled up here, they would go in and have a few beers. And
Wherrymen worked hard and tend to play hard as well. So, you know, lots of talks of fights over some kind of incident that happened on the way up the river, or somebody pinched somebody's water, you know, all that kind of thing. Lots of rivalry. So they were hard men, but their women were fairly doughty as well. And there's quite a few tales of the Wherryman so sloshed that he couldn't take control of his boat, and the woman would carry him back on board and take charge of the boat and sail it off herself.
Well, as I understand it, the lock came first. It was a private navigation. This building was a lockkeeper's cottage. He was taking tolls. It was a natural bottleneck on the river. It was just a natural progression to start selling refreshments to people, and I think it was in the 1720s it was granted a public house licence in the old style where a house was licensed to sell to the public. And it's, you know, so we're talking nearly 300 years of the history of a pub. I still get people coming in saying, did you know Susan Ellis? I remember Susan Ellis. She was a particular character just because of the longevity of her stay here and her tenure here. And what I will say is I must take my hat off to the old girl to survive the winter she did down here with a gas lamp and an open fire when I've got the benefits of electricity, gas, diesel heating. She must have been a tough old bird indeed.
I mean, gosh, Susan, the stories she had. Actually, one night she said she had a knock on the door and it was the policeman to say that there was a van floating in the river with a little dog on. And so Susan, in her way, she said, well, I didn't know what they were talking about. And I went into the woodshed later that night and there was 2 bodies laying, and the police had left the bodies in my woodshed, which is perfectly true. And she was a tough, tough cookie.
She had previously been housekeeper to the previous landlord, whom she always referred to as Grumpy. We never knew what his real name was, but Susan ran it in her own way, and she had strict rules. When you bought a round of drinks, you didn't pay for them. She kept your score till the end of the evening and then added it up. And I remember that evening when it was getting dark, she came in with 2 candles, said we'd better have some power on. And then at closing time she came in, clapped her hands, said amen, and that was it. Everyone's score was added up. We went away quietly, no arguing.
She was an Irish lady and she was very to herself, and if the pub flooded and, well, the police came down once to get her out and she wouldn't go. She said, I haven't put my red blanket out and I'm not ready to leave. And she wouldn't. And people used to bring her water and everything down here.
My father worked on a farm in Geldeston, and when dinner time come, the horseman said, should we go in locks and have a pint? So they did. And in them days, there was no electricity, and the only light down the cellar would be a candle. If you wanted a pint, you had to take the glass and go down the steps and draw the pint and then bring it up back up the stairs, which is what they did. And Charlie that was the horseman. He was a great beer drinker, and he could tip up a pint and it would run straight down. And he did this with this pint, and he had something in his mouth when he finished. And so he rolled it round his mouth a couple of times and spit it out on the floor, and it was a great big slug.
But there was no bar in here. She used to go out the back and get whatever was needed. I don't know of any other pub that's like it. But we used to do swimming and everything down here.
One woman who used to come down there with her 2 sons when they were quite young, and she thought she would teach them to swim. And she stood in the river and with the water up to her chest, and she had the most enormous chest. And my youngest brother, he learned to swim when he was about 4, but he couldn't. He thought he could make it across, and he realised he wasn't going to make it. So he made a grab at her, and he grabbed her most prominent part, or one of them, and she was absolutely livid. And so she grabbed hold of him and slapped him and threw him out on the bank. Well, he was crying, and there were several of us boys there, and we thought, well, we aren't going to put up with that. So we made some mud balls and we mudballed her. So she looked even less attractive after that than she did before. For some funny reason, I never saw her come there again.
It's not a community pub in terms of, you know, an estate corner local where everybody goes to, but here everybody from all walks of life uses the pub. It's a scattered, diverse rural community, but whether they're going to pop in for a pint, show it off to visitors, have a family wedding, family birthday, this is the venue that they come to. We've got to remember it's only in the last 30 years, as I understand it, there's been some kind of track such as it is down to the pub, and people had to either walk some way across the marshes, across footpaths, or arrive by river.
Well, Grumpy had that old motor car which I got at home, and the brewery's never delivered. He used to go down to the railway station and collect the beer and bring it up himself. You see, the brewers would never come down here. They wouldn't, not in those days, they wouldn't send a big lorry down here because the road was terrible. And also the road used to flood at every tide. It's been built up now, so you'd have about a foot of water to go through. He used to go down there and get the beer in the back of his car.
The area around Geldeston would flood a lot, particularly on the Broads. After you get heavy rain, the water's trying to get away, and if you get an easterly wind, that's holding the water back. And particularly up in the higher reaches of the rivers, you get floods. And at Geldeston, it would flood deep enough around the lock for the wherrymen to think, hey, up, we can make some time here. And they missed the lock out altogether and sail across the fields. Must have been quite a remarkable sight, I thought.
You need to regulate the water if you're moving big cargo carrying boats up and down. You need also to regulate it if you don't want to be flooded. And neither Barsham nor Geldeston wanted to be flooded, but they were quite happy to push the water the other's way. So they built a mill which never ground corn or anything like that. All its purpose was to try and maintain the level of the water. I think throughout the Broads there are quite a lot of these drainage mills which are used to maintain the level of the water.
There was a brick pillar with a stone inlaid in it which said this is the site of the old mill, and that was on the little footpath that goes along beside the river there. And when you look at it, I could never make out, that must have been much wider, because how you got a wherry, which would be about 50 odd feet long, through the lock, and then sharp round to the right and round that little bendy bit.
The flood relief channel, that was put in the 1960s, I think about 1965. If the navigation is ever restored, this lock will not be used because they'll go straight up the flood relief channel, but the water won't be held up. So at low tide, some boats may not be able to get through to Ellingham, they may have to wait. I was an officer of the River Commissioners. I got home one day and my wife pointed out an advert in the Eastern Daily Press that this property was going to be sold by auction. I thought, oh yes. I thought, oh my gosh, if that gets into private hands, we'll lose the moorings. So I put it to the commissioners that they should try to buy it. I said, you'll think I'm mad, but... And anyway, no, they agreed we should try to, and they agreed a limited auction, and I think it was 14,000. Went to the auction and got it for just less than that. But the underbidder, who would otherwise have bought it, was going to use it as a weekend cottage. And that would have been the end of it, both for the moorings and as a public house. Well then Walter came on the scene, he approached the commissioners, could he run it as a pub for the rest of that summer? So the commissioners agreed to that. He was given not a lease, but a license to run it for the rest of that summer. And then at the end of the summer, they had to decide what they were going to do. So the commissioner decided to sell it, and they sold it to Walter. So he bought it, and he kept it going as a pub.
When my father actually bought it, it was just like a house on a desert. There was no refuge collection, no water, no electricity. I know there still isn't electricity, but at the time we had a bore put down, which we had to keep taking the water to Cambridge to have it analysed. But yes, I mean, both my sister and I worked there, and it was very much run within the family. And because of the flooding, you see, you're then restricted on getting access to get down there. My father always was he would watch about the winds and the tides. Don't ask me which, what, where. But you know, we'd all be told, right, and we'd sort of try and get as much upstairs as we could. But obviously not living there, it wasn't so bad for us because there was a lot of space to stash everything upstairs. And you just really had to wait and watch for it to start coming in. And then wait for it to go down, and then all hands on deck to scrub out the silt and filthy, dirty river water that leaves behind.
We used to go on the marshes skating when that froze, and that did used to freeze quite hard. They'd flood, and then the ice would get quite thick on top, and then the water would drain away underneath, and the ice would settle down on the land. So that was perfectly safe to skate on. The only thing about it was that it would crack to its own level. So you had ups and downs on skating. I don't know where else you could get skating where you have ups and downs in it, but you did there. And we used to do that on moonlight nights. We used to go down there, and we thought it was wonderful.
We were married at Geldeston Church, and we had a reception in the village hall. And then we parked a boat down here and went on a boat to Beccles, where we'd hid the car up. But because people tried to chase us, and my father-in-law got on the bridge with his father, who was well in his 80s then, to block the road. So, and a friend of ours tried to jump the haycock to get past, but didn't succeed. Damaged his car instead.
In Geldeston, there have been 2 occasions when it's as though someone has pulled the plug and the whole of that canal has gone dry. Extraordinary. You know, when there's water up in the river and the canal goes dry.
Well, I think that's a marvellous area. Absolutely. I mean, if you look across here, anywhere here, this landscape has hardly changed in the 18th century. This is more or less like Constable country, if you think of it. You know, just marshes and trees and little woods, and it's very, very unspoilt.
The Locks is a beautiful place. It's a lovely setting. It is unique in every shape and way.
Because every single day, without fail, there's a point when I stop and think, what a beautiful sight. And I really mean that.